All right, we're going to follow up on that intro video and now look at policy, standards, and practices and try to define each of these terms and how they work together. So let's start off with policy. So policy is going to be some plan or course of action that influences decisions. It has the characteristic that it's going to need to be effective and require constant modification and maintenance so that it's relevant to a particular organization. You have to disseminate it, so people need to know where to find it. They've got to read it, they got to understand it, they got to agree to it, and you got to uniformly enforce it. So lots and lots of things go into policy. Typically policies, especially as compared to standards and practices, do not change very often. So you want to make policies as these kind of overarching, large conveyance of what you want employees to do, and then you'll get into the details using those standards and practices. So just think of policies all the way at the top, standards and practices a bit below that level, and where you've got increased specificity, and you've also got it where the standards and the practices or guidelines are going to change more often, more frequently than your policies. Okay, let's go ahead and look at these three terms. I've used them now, policy, standards, and practices. So what do I mean by those words? There we are. In this particular case, I've listed out the information security policies, three types, and we're going to have a video on each of these types: an enterprise information security program policy, a issue-specific information security policy, and a system-specific policy. All right, so what are standards? Standards are a more detailed statement of what must be done to comply with policy. So you're taking that policy and saying, well, my goodness, how do I implement this? And then under practices, or sometimes they're called procedures or guidelines, you take those standards and then again move them to a different level of specificity so that you can address the needs of the employees. What do I do? What do I do if something abnormal happens? You can capture them in these documents. And again, policy is going to be your kind of overarching document, standards more detailed, and then the practices, procedures, or guidelines even more detailed than that. All right. So let's look at this a slightly different way. Policies are going to be sanctioned by senior management. Standards are built on top of that, carry the weight of policy, and then these practices, procedures, and guidelines are detailed steps to meet these. Now, if you look within the University System of Georgia, the Board of Regents is the only group that can establish policy. So what does the policy say, for example, around information technology? In our particular case, the policy says that the chancellor and the institutional presidents are responsible for implementing information technology policy, and they'll be held accountable for that. And it says that the institution and system level CIOs are responsible as well, and that we are responsible for developing standards, practices, and procedures around information technology without bringing it back to the board. So we have that authority, and we will periodically go back and brief the board on our success. So that's really what you find in the policy. You're establishing who's responsible, and you're establishing the authority of who can write the standards. So with the understanding that those standards carry the weight of policy. Again, looking at USG, University System of Georgia, our standards around IT are captured within a IT handbook. So that IT handbook takes the policy and then starts to implement that. There are probably 10 chapters, as I recall, within that particular standard. And then we build in varying degrees of specific actions that the institutions have to take that we're all going to subscribe to. As you might imagine, with 31 different institutions across the university system of Georgia, we have to be careful in terms of how specific we get within those standards. Because what we want to really do is use those standards to put some boundaries around acceptable behavior. So you'll hear me often talk about left and right boundaries of behavior, but the idea, or acceptable bands of behavior, is another way. Having a band of excellence around behavior associated with information technology, and using policy is one of those components that create some barriers or to moving into unacceptable behavior as it relates to information technology. So what we've done is talked a bit about policy standards, practices, guidelines, procedures, the differences between the two, provided a context for how they work together. And so what we're going to do in the next video is look at a enterprise information security policy, or program policy to be specific, and talk about the components of that. So stay tuned, fasten that seatbelt. We're going to start to accelerate as we dig into the details of computer security policy.